Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome Mike Chinoy to campus, and we're grateful that he'd take time out of his busy schedule to come. And we're grateful that you, as students, would take time out of your busy studies to come too. Mike Chinoy joined the Pacific Council on International Policy in Los Angeles in July 2006 as the Edgerton Fellow in Korean Security, focusing on security issues in North Korea, China, and Northeast Asia. He has just completed the book that he'll talk about today, The History of the North Korean Nuclear Crisis, entitled Meltdown, The Inside Story of the North Korean Nuclear Crisis. It was published by St. Martin's Press in August of 2008 and has been held by the Washington Post as a tour de force of reporting. I'd encourage all of you to read it. It's actually on sale out here for you. It's an exciting read. He previously spent 24 years as a foreign correspondent for CNN, including stints as a roving reporter based in London and NBC News in Hong Kong in the 1970s after completing a journalism degree at Columbia University. Mr. Chinoy is also the author of an acclaimed book called China Live, People Power and the Television Revolution, and has received numerous awards for his journalism, including the Emmy, Peabody, and DuPont Awards for his coverage of the 1989 Tiananmen Square crisis, and a DuPont Award for his coverage of the tsunami. He holds a BA from Yale University and a master's degree from Columbia School of Journalism. Mr. Chinoy previously his access to North Korea is unmatched among American journalists. He has visited the country 14 times since 1989, more than any other U.S. reporter. He was the only journalist to accompany former U.S. President Jimmy Carter on his historic trip to Pyongyang in 1994, and he has returned regularly, and most recently in 2005. So please welcome Mike Chinoy.
Thanks very much. This is my first trip to Utah. I've been to so many countries around the world, but never managed to get here. I'm very pleased to be here. It's a beautiful place. And coming from L.A. and before that Hong Kong in the tropics, it was nice to see a little bit of snow flurries this morning. It's not something I've seen a lot of lately. I do appreciate you all taking time. I gather you're in the throes of the run-up to the end of the semester, so thanks very much for coming here and sharing a little bit of time. What I wanted to do is to talk a little bit about my book and about what's going on in North Korea today. And I want to begin by telling you not about North Korea's current leader, Kim Jong-il, but about his father, Kim Il-sung. It was in spring of 1994, on the day after his 82nd birthday, and I was part of a group that had spent about 90 minutes talking with Kim at the Kungsusang Palace, which was this massive marbled monstrosity with 100-foot-high ceilings, everything aligned in perfect symmetry and not a speck of dust or dirt anywhere in sight. We ate lunch in this room with this gorgeous view of the hills that surround Pyongyang, and before we began, the great leader, as the North Koreans call him, stood up to give a toast. And as he did so, it seemed as if the rays of the sun kind of poured through the windows and bathed him in this kind of golden glow. And then as he sat down, the glow appeared to fade, and we went on with the lunch, which was absolutely fascinating. And he talked about the nuclear issue, how he wanted a negotiated solution with the United States for the crisis that was then brewing, which became the first North Korean nuclear crisis. He told other interesting stories, including how, even though he was 82, he still liked to go hunting, but he wasn't really up to doing it properly. So his soldiers would go find a bear and stick it in a tree and give him a rifle so he could go out and take a shot and indulge his passion for hunting even in his old age. Anyway, as we left, my cameraman, who notices these things, leaned over in amazement and whispered to me, he said, "Did you see the lights?" And I said, "No, what are you talking about?" And the cameraman, who was watching carefully, said that at the moment when Kim got up, at the point where the wall and the ceiling intersect, he noticed tiny little lights had apparently been cranked up by somebody outside the room, almost invisible. And then when he sat down, they'd been cranked back down, and it was this artificial device, my cameraman was convinced, and not the rays of the sun, that had given Kim this amazing special aura. And I love to tell this story because it underscores the fact that when you're dealing with North Korea, you can never be sure just what's real and what's not. I do have to say, sometimes given the amount of spin among the rival factions in the Bush administration, I frequently had a similar sensation on my many visits to Washington to do the interviews to research this book. But anyway, with that caveat, let me talk a little bit about the book and about where things stand with North Korea today. Meltdown is a work of investigative reporting. I spent nearly 2 years and interviewed more than 200 people, some of them not once but many times, in the hope of piecing together the story of the North Korean nuclear crisis. I came into it with no preconceived notions, no axe to grind, no particular agenda, except my interest fueled by my many visits and having covered the situation over many years when I worked for CNN. And the goal was just to try and get the story right, because it is a really amazing story. How North Korea staged its nuclear breakout, how a U.S. administration whose top priority was to prevent so-called rogue states from acquiring weapons of mass destruction was not able to stop Kim Jong-il's regime from doing just that. Why and how the Bush administration abruptly reversed course from confrontation to negotiation, and what this tells us both about the making of foreign policy in the Bush administration and also about how the North Korean leadership and political system operates. I want to talk about some of the key headlines from the book because I think they'll help shed some light both on the general environment in which U.S. policy toward North Korea has been made and on what's happening now. Meltdown documents in more detail than has previously been available how fierce bureaucratic infighting left the Bush administration with a policy toward North Korea that I would describe as incoherent, dysfunctional, and often self-defeating. These battles between the so-called hardliners like Vice President Cheney, John Bolton, and others who opposed real negotiations with North Korea, and those who favored a diplomatic approach like former Secretary of State Colin Powell, current Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, Chris Hill, and his boss, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, shape almost every development that I cover in Meltdown. And it produced episodes that in some ways would be comical if the stakes weren't so high. For example, Vice President Cheney personally intervening with President Bush to overrule Colin Powell's instructions to his negotiator at the six-party talks in Beijing in ways that the North Koreans were certain to reject, development that could have jeopardized the entire six-party process. Or Powell and his Secretary of State Richard Armitage, seen here with President Bush at the ranch in Crawford, Texas, keeping to themselves and not sharing with other officials news delivered by North Korean diplomats to State Department officials that Pyongyang had begun reprocessing plutonium. Or hardliners disparagingly calling the State Department's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs EAPsers, and mocking Christopher Hill, the Assistant Secretary of State, as Kim Jong-il. So this was the climate in which the Bush administration tried to have a policy on North Korea, and it provides the context for the book's next headline. Meltdown details just how this stunning turnaround in Bush administration policy towards North Korea in the past couple of years took place. It shows how Assistant Secretary Hill seized control of the policy process, first by violating instructions from his boss, Secretary of State Rice, and holding unauthorized bilateral meetings with the North Koreans. There we go. And then after we went to, okay, this technology, okay, and then after winning Rice over to his side by freezing out hardline opponents of engagement. As Hill negotiated with the North Koreans, he and Rice simply kept their bureaucratic rivals in Washington in the dark, not informing them of key meetings, and presenting agreements only after they'd been reached, and Rice had convinced President Bush to sign off on them. The whole normal interagency process that is standard in the government, preparing position papers, drafting talking points, circulating them through the bureaucracy, didn't happen. As one person I interviewed described it, the policy process became Hill calls Rice and Rice calls Bush. Given the opposition, the intense opposition among the hardliners to any deal with North Korea, this was probably the only way that Hill could have achieved the diplomatic breakthroughs that he has. But it left him politically isolated and without a lot of friends and allies in Washington when the negotiating process reached numerous critical points as we have seen in recent months, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Meltdown also reveals that the nuclear crisis which erupted in 2002 and which led directly to North Korea testing a nuclear bomb and becoming the world's 8th declared nuclear power might, in fact, have been avoidable and was to a considerable degree provoked by administration hardliners who spun intelligence about a North Korean effort to procure components that might have been used to make a uranium-based nuclear weapon into claims of a full-fledged production capability to make a uranium bomb that did not then and does not now exist. The conventionally accepted narrative is that the U.S. uncovered a clandestine North Korean uranium enrichment program, that the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia at the time, James Kelly, confronted the North Koreans about it during a visit to Pyongyang in October of 2002, and they admitted the charge. This led to the U.S. decision to cut off supplies of oil promised to the North under an earlier deal negotiated in 1994 by the Clinton administration called the Agreed Framework. And that, in turn, triggered Pyongyang's decision to restart the Yongbyon nuclear reactor, which was frozen under that 1994 Agreed Framework deal, and to stage its subsequent nuclear breakout, culminating in the 2006 nuclear test. Meltdown shows that in the spring and summer of 2002, U.S. intelligence did discover a North Korean effort to acquire components that could be used for uranium enrichment. I think somebody's head, there we go, is blocking this signal. Anyway, but the intelligence found only a procurement effort. There was no credible intelligence then, and there hasn't been any credible intelligence since, to show that North Korea had or has an actual uranium enrichment facility that would enable it to make a uranium bomb. Apologies if I'm beaming your head there. This distinction may seem academic, but in fact it's absolutely critical. Given the enormous technical challenges involved in assembling a working system of centrifuges that could enrich uranium in sufficient quantities to produce nuclear weapons, the CIA in late 2002 believed it would be mid-decade at the earliest and possibly up to 10 more years before any such plant would be fully operational. The longer time frame meant that the issue, while serious, was not an immediate threat, and it might have been possible to negotiate a resolution to the matter without sparking a new crisis on the Korean Peninsula, had the Bush administration been willing to negotiate at the time. However, administration hardliners who were intent on killing the agreed framework, which they viewed as appeasement by the wimpish Clinton administration, seized on the issue to force a confrontation. After Vice President Cheney directly intervened with President Bush, the original talking points for Assistant Secretary of State Kelly were overruled, and he was given instructions for his trip in October of 2002 not to negotiate. Instead, his instructions dictated that he simply tell the North Koreans they had to abandon their uranium program before any progress on any other issue was possible. He was also ordered not to observe normal diplomatic courtesies, such as holding a reciprocal banquet for his North Korean hosts, or even making a toast at a meal they hosted for him upon his arrival. There we go. Okay. Although at the time, Kelly and other members of his delegation came away convinced that North Korea's first vice foreign minister, Kang Suk-ju, had in fact admitted the uranium allegation. Interviews I did with many members of this group, plus with others who later saw the transcript that the Americans prepared of the conversation, raised serious doubts about whether the North Koreans in fact did do so. The actual language the North Korean official used was much more ambiguous. He talked about North Korea's right to have such weapons, but he did not explicitly say that the North Koreans had them. I should point out that the Bush administration continues to refuse to declassify the transcript, despite repeated requests made under the Freedom of Information Act. Maybe the Obama administration will be more forthcoming, and we can put some of the lingering question marks and doubts about this absolutely pivotal diplomatic encounter to rest. In the book, I also note that the North at the same meeting offered to negotiate a solution to the controversy, but this was an offer that Assistant Secretary Kelly was under instructions to reject. A private message from Kim Jong-il to President Bush sent through American intermediaries the following month, which also appealed for talks, was also ignored in Washington. Finally, Meltdown highlights some key aspects of North Korean behavior. There's a conventional view about the current North Korean leader, Kim Jong-il, that he's crazy or irrational, that he's someone who's impossible to deal with. The reality, though, based on interviews I did with a number of people who had met and negotiated with Kim over the years, including Madeleine Albright, seen here on her October 2002 visit. And I should point out, just parenthetically, the fellow in the middle, who's Kim Jong-il's interpreter, I wasn't on the Albright trip, but I was there a couple of weeks before. And when I saw these pictures, I was flabbergasted because that guy, Kim Chol, had been my interpreter on numerous trips to North Korea. And he never, ever let on that he also did interpreting for the great general, the dear leader, Kim Jong-il. But anyway, both Albright and the former South Korean president Kim Dae-jung and many other both American and South Korean officials who had a chance to be in meetings with Kim Jong-il paint a very different picture. They invariably describe him as smart, shrewd, well-briefed, very much in charge, and throughout this whole crisis with a clear strategic goal, which is survival. Let me share one anecdote that I think is very revealing about the North Korean mindset. You remember I mentioned the Kumsusong Palace. After Kim Il-sung's death, it was turned into a mausoleum housing his embalmed remains, and on one of my trips I was taken there. When you visit, you join this vast throng of somber-faced North Koreans, and you glide along a moving walkway for nearly a kilometer until you reach a series of vast marble corridors. At the end of them, you end up in this chamber with a giant white marble statue of the great leader illuminated from behind by pink lights. Not all that different from the sensation when I had lunch with him in the fake rosy glow that they manufactured on that earlier visit. Then you go up this set of marble stairs into the cavernous room where his remains are displayed. They wouldn't let us take pictures in there, but you walk around a large glass case containing his embalmed body, which is dressed in a suit covered with a North Korean flag from the chest down. And then you follow the crowds down a set of stairs to some adjoining rooms. And here the North Koreans had managed to install both Kim's favorite train carriage, because like his son, he didn't like to fly, and this bulletproof Mercedes given as a gift to his father by Kim Jong-il. And then you get to the final stop, where again, for some reason, we weren't allowed to take pictures. But it's an exhibition containing some of the 140,000 gifts that Kim Il-sung received from foreign dignitaries in his lifetime. And this is the point of this rather complicated tale, because among the items on display that struck me were a big belt of merit order from the Polish People's Republic, the Order of Freedom First Class from the People's Socialist Republic of Albania, a medal for the Lenin Centenary from the Soviet Union, and the Karl Marx Order from East Germany. And what was so striking to me was how many of these gifts came from states that no longer existed, and from communist leaders like Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu, or East Germany's Erich Honecker, or Albania's Enver Hoxha, who had been toppled and tossed, and to use that old communist phrase, onto the dustbin of history. All of them were Kim Il-sung's contemporaries, and he outlived all of them, and his system, for all its weirdness, outlasted theirs. And now, in the post-Cold War world, deprived of its longtime alliances with the Soviet Union and China, with the collapse of all its other communist allies, regime survival, keeping the system intact in a hostile world, has become the all-consuming priority of the North Korean leadership. I think understanding this issue from Pyongyang's point of view is key to making sense of North Korea today. In North Korean eyes, the key to survival at a time when almost all the world's other communist states have collapsed is the U.S. Pyongyang believes that only the U.S., its longtime enemy and now the world's only superpower, can provide the security guarantees to ensure that North Korea doesn't follow its former communist comrades into oblivion. In the same vein, the North Koreans believe the U.S. holds the key to the international community, to recognition, trade, and aid that might pull the country out of its economic decline and ensure its long-term viability. This, in my view, is at the heart of North Korea's international strategy, and you can see it very clearly on the nuclear issue. Many have seen North Korea's move to develop a nuclear capability as just the latest step by a wacky, irrational, and dangerous regime. But a much more plausible explanation, in my view, is that North Korea sees nukes as the only way to ensure its security against a hostile U.S., and that they might, for the right price, real security guarantees from Washington, the lifting of sanctions, economic aid, full diplomatic recognition, be coaxed into abandoning them. Interestingly, when treated with respect in a genuine negotiating process of give and take, which incidentally they repeatedly appealed for from the moment George W. Bush took office, the record shows that the North Koreans have in fact been open to resolving their differences with the U.S. through negotiations. Even at moments of extreme tension, as I document in Meltdown, the North Koreans consistently signaled their desire for talks. One example, which was largely ignored at the time, comes from the official statement announcing the North's nuclear test in October of 2006. Pyongyang declared that it still remains unchanged in its will to denuclearize the peninsula through dialogue and negotiation. The DPRK is ready for both dialogue and confrontation. Moreover, despite their reputation as difficult negotiators, for example, it took only 2 months at the six-party talks in the late summer of 2005 to agree on what became known as the September 19th, 2005 Declaration, which has laid out a set of principles for resolving the nuclear crisis. This is Christopher Hill shaking hands with his North Korean counterpart Kim Gwan at the signing of that declaration as South Korea's envoy at the time looks on. And it took only about the same amount of time, just a couple of months, to reach the February 13th, 2007 deal, which spelled out a detailed roadmap for denuclearization and paved the way as an important first step for the shutdown of North Korea's Yongbyon nuclear reactor. Critics argue that North Korea is not sincere and it doesn't keep the agreements that it signed, and I would say that skepticism is certainly in order. But because of the constant flip-flopping and mixed signals coming from Washington, the situation has never reached a point where the North's intentions could really truly be tested. One thing, however, is abundantly clear, and it was evident as I did the research for the book. The experience of the last 7 or 8 years does show that pressure and coercion don't work with North Korea. Instead, the predictable North Korean response when pushed has been to push back even harder, to make it clear it won't knuckle under whatever the cost, even to its own people. So all in all, Meltdown is a pretty dramatic tale, and I found in my research that there was also a fascinating kind of spy underworld aspect to it, from the story of the Banco Delta Asia, the sleazy Macau bank. Macau is a former Portuguese colony next to Hong Kong, where the North Koreans supposedly ran a money laundering and counterfeiting operation to the murder of a North Korean agent in Pakistan just days after Pakistan's own nuclear test, and the role of the rogue Pakistani nuclear scientist A.Q. Khan to the role of a South Korean spy in North Korea. But to get all those juicy details, I'm afraid you'll have to buy the book. Anyway, that brings me to what's happening today. I mentioned this February 13th, 2007 deal. Since then, and another more detailed agreement reached on October 3rd of last year, there have been some important steps forward. Under the deal, the North Koreans shut down operations at Yongbyon and admitted U.S. and international inspectors, including, interestingly, Christopher Hill himself, seen here in protective clothing on his first visit to the North Korean complex, and took a series of steps to disable the facility. That development was symbolized by the televised destruction of the cooling tower in Yongbyon in June. In return, the North Koreans got shipments of heavy fuel oil and other aid, and then things moved to the next stage of the process. This involved the North providing a declaration of its nuclear facilities, and the U.S. then taking North Korea off Washington's list of state sponsors of terrorism. The successful completion of these steps was supposed to end what diplomats call Phase 2 of the process, Phase 1 being those initial understandings reached in February of 2007. This would open the way to Phase 3, in which the actual denuclearization of North Korea, dismantling as opposed to just disabling all the nuclear facilities, and getting rid of the North's stockpile of nuclear weapons would be negotiated. But reaching the agreement on the declaration that is so critical to Phase 2 turned out to be a complicated and frustrating process and was the catalyst for problems that have slowed the diplomatic process in recent months. And here's my understanding of the behind-the-scenes story of why that's happened. In negotiating the terms of this North Korean declaration last spring, Christopher Hill tried to get the North Koreans to address a couple of key questions: what they may have done to develop a uranium enrichment capability, and the nature and extent of North Korea's nuclear cooperation with Syria. As I noted earlier, it was U.S. intelligence in 2002 about a North Korean effort to procure components that could have been used to build a facility to make a uranium-based bomb, and the hardliners' contention that the efforts represented an immediate as opposed to a long-term threat that set off the current crisis. The Syrian issue emerged after intelligence appeared to show that Damascus was allegedly building a nuclear reactor seen in the middle of the satellite photograph with North Korean help. When Christopher Hill pushed the North Koreans to come clean on both these issues, though, they balked, and it's hard to be sure just why. It may just be the secretive nature of the place. Possibly, though, the North Koreans felt burned the last time they tried so-called confession diplomacy. This is when Kim Jong-il admitted to Japan's Prime Minister Koizumi in 2002 that North Korean agents had abducted Japanese citizens in the late 1970s and early 1980s. However, instead of resolving this issue and leading to progress on improving ties with Japan, as the North Koreans had hoped, the admission triggered an intense backlash in Japan, so much so that the abductee issue continues to poison Japan-North Korean relations today. Whatever the reasons, under the circumstances, Christopher Hill argued that the immediate threat to U.S. security was Yongbyon. That's where the North made the plutonium for its bombs, and unless it was shut down, he argued, it could make more bombs now. On uranium, despite this 2002 intelligence about a procurement effort, as I mentioned, there's never been any credible intelligence that North Korea actually had a facility to be able to enrich uranium and actually make a bomb, and was still likely to be years away from being able to do so. As for Syria, as you can see from this photo, whatever the North Koreans may have been helping the Syrians to build was turned into kind of like a parking lot after the Israeli Air Force staged a raid in September of 2007. So insisting that the North come clean on uranium in Syria when it was clear Pyongyang wasn't prepared to do so, Hill believed could jeopardize the whole process, and if it broke down over these issues, the North would be free to continue operations at Yongbyon. So he argued for a compromise under which the declaration would deal only with plutonium, while the North Koreans in side documents to the declaration would acknowledge Washington's concerns about uranium in Syria, with the clear understanding that the U.S. would press for more details at a later stage in the process. Initially, President Bush and Secretary of State Rice agreed, and in late June, the President announced the beginning of the process of taking North Korea off the terrorism list. Then something happened. Critics both within the administration, like Vice President Cheney, and outside, like former UN Ambassador John Bolton, who remains a leading voice for the hardline group, denounced the deal, arguing that the declaration Hill had negotiated lacked credibility. They insisted that the U.S. demand the North accept an intrusive set of verification measures before it could be taken off the terrorism list. The upshot was that in July, the State Department's Bureau of Verification, which used to report to Bolton and remains a bastion of hardline views, was given the job of coming up with a detailed verification plan. What they drafted was extraordinarily intrusive, demanding unhindered access to all suspect North Korean facilities anywhere at any time. A memo leaked to the Washington Post gives you some sense of this approach. Among the things that they wanted to ask the North Koreans for was full access to any North Korean site, facility, or location, including military facilities, and that the North Koreans address all elements to include uranium enrichment and proliferation activities, which is code language for Syria. This, of course, these points were in direct contradiction to the understanding Christopher Hill had reached with the North Koreans in the spring. The plan was so intrusive that David Albright, president of the Institute for Science and Security and a former weapons inspector in Iraq, said it would be completely unacceptable to any country's sovereignty and would amount to a license to spy on North Korean military facilities. That the hardliners pushed this approach and that the details were then leaked to the press was yet another reflection of the continuing discord and internal battles within the administration over North Korea policy. And when the list of demands was presented to the North Koreans, not surprisingly, they were furious and then denounced it as an outright violation of previous U.S. commitments. As this North Korean Foreign Ministry statement in August noted, there was no language in any of the deals signed in 2007 requiring them to agree to verification as a condition for being taken off the terrorism list. Privately, senior U.S. officials confirmed to me that this North Korean interpretation was, in fact, correct. So in response, the North tried its normal tactic, which is brinksmanship, They restarted the Yongbyon reactor, limited access by international inspectors, and took some steps which looked like possible preparations for another nuclear test. With the situation in danger of getting out of control, Chris Hill went back to Pyongyang at the beginning of October and hammered out a compromise. Under this compromise, North Korea did agree that inspectors would be allowed to look at declared nuclear facilities, but access to other sites would have to be agreed through mutual consent. And U.S. officials hinted that Chris Hill had reached a series of verbal understandings on Syria and on uranium and on the procedures to bring in the necessary equipment to take soil and environmental samples to get a full and complete picture of what had occurred at the North Korean nuclear sites to allow the process to move forward. Under the circumstances, it was probably the best deal Hill could get, and he did this time manage to convince Secretary Rice and President Bush to sign off on it. This enabled the North to be taken off the U.S. list of terrorism to predictable howls of protest from the hardliners. The deal does achieve some key goals. First, the North has agreed to resume the process of disabling Yongbyon. The further along that process is, of course, the less leverage North Korea has by threatening to restart the facility. And it also likely removes a potential headache for President Obama, who will now come into a situation in which the disabling of the Yongbyon reactor is continuing, and the stage is set for negotiations that could move the process forward. It's a lot better than taking office just as the North States starts making more bombs at a reactivated Yongbyon reactor. But since then, however, there have been some other bumps in the road. Whatever verbal assurances Hill reached with the North Koreans about allowing verification to proceed have not been matched by North Korean willingness to put such detailed commitments into writing, particularly on the issue of bringing in equipment and taking samples. Instead, Pyongyang has made it very clear that for it to agree to such steps, it's going to need a quid pro quo from the U.S., either more aid or some kind of diplomatic gesture. Moreover, the North Koreans contend that verification is actually part of the next phase of negotiations, the so-called Phase 3, and can't begin until all the steps in Phase 2 have been completed. Specifically, from the North Korean perspective, that means delivery of all the heavy fuel oil and other aid that it was promised at the six-party talks. The North Koreans have been demanding that the U.S. provide a written schedule of when those aid deliveries are going to take place. But this has run into trouble in part because of the Japanese. The Japanese were very much opposed to taking North Korea off the terrorism list. The reason is their anger over the North's failure to clear up unanswered questions about the fate of these abductees. And when the Bush administration went ahead and delisted the North, there was very bad feeling between Tokyo and Washington. And the Japanese said that they were not going to pay for their share of the aid that was promised to the North as the price for disabling the Yongbyon reactor. So now the U.S. is scrambling to try and find some other countries. They've approached Australia, New Zealand. They may approach the European Union to come up with the equivalent of 200,000 tons of heavy fuel oil. And if the North doesn't get it, it's entirely possible that Pyongyang will claim legitimately that the other parties aren't delivering on their promises, and they might slow down or halt the disabling process. The other big question mark has to do with the health of Kim Jong-il. By all accounts, he did have a stroke in mid-August, and this has raised questions about uncertainty in the North Korean leadership. The fact that this latest verification deal in October was reached, however, suggests to me that he's still ultimately calling the shots, because it's hard to imagine North Korea signing off on such a deal without his okay. But there's no question that it's brought to the forefront the issue of the succession in North Korea, and it's very unclear where that's going. By the time his own father was 66, Kim Jong-il had been the designated heir for a half dozen years. But from publicly available evidence, none of his three sons from two different women have been put forward as his heirs. The oldest, Kim Jong-nam, is best known for having been detained by Japanese immigration officials at Tokyo Airport while traveling on a fake Dominican Republic passport, and his excuse was that he was coming to visit the Tokyo Disneyland. True story. About the two younger sons, almost nothing is known except they reportedly attended at some elite boarding school in Switzerland, and one was supposedly spotted somewhere in Europe attending an Eric Clapton concert. So there doesn't appear to be a succession mechanism in place. There are some predictions that when Kim dies, North Korea will collapse. My own sense is that's not going to happen, at least not immediately. I think the military will take charge as it's done in Myanmar, in Burma, and rule in his name. And I don't think we'd see an earlier catastrophic collapse of the North Korean system, but they will undoubtedly become more difficult to deal with on the nuclear issue. So this is the extraordinarily complex situation Barack Obama and his administration will inherit, a diplomatic process that's alive but struggling with many ways it could go off the rails. My sense is that Obama and his advisors are committed to pursuing the diplomatic path, and they're unlikely to be the same kind of bitter internal battles over the value of simply talking to the North Koreans as we saw in the Bush administration. Indeed, for the North Koreans, Obama could be the first U.S. president who appears both willing and with enough political clout to be able to move towards the kind of comprehensive overall deal they claim to have been seeking. But the great irony is that it's much less clear now whether the North at this stage is really interested in such a deal anymore, especially one that would actually require it to give up its nuclear bombs. Having staged the nuclear test, facing a potentially unsettling leadership transition, and still, given the deep suspicion that exists between Washington and Pyongyang, some analysts believe the North may have taken this goal of ultimate denuclearization off the agenda, at least for now. It certainly wants still an accommodation with the U.S., but it may well see India or Pakistan, the model of India or Pakistan, both countries which defied international criticism and denunciations from Washington and went nuclear, but where the U.S. came to accept their nuclear status as a model, rather than, say, Libya, where Colonel Gaddafi abandoned his nuclear ambitions in return for a rapprochement with the United States. The tragedy of the Bush years is that when George W. Bush took office, North Korea had perhaps between 1 and 2 bombs worth of weapons-grade plutonium. Now, in large part to what he saw as the Bush administration's efforts to do him in, Kim Jong-il and his regime have acquired enough material for anywhere from 6 to 10 bombs by most estimates, and it's proudly declared both to the world and to its own people that it's a nuclear power. So Kim has a lot more to give up now, and it will be a lot harder to convince him to do so. Unfortunately, North Korea is in a position to demand a much higher price from the U.S. for any future moves towards denuclearization if it's prepared to take such steps at all than would have been the case had the Bush administration chosen the path of negotiations. And I don't know how much of a retreat he's going to make, and we could conceivably have the North and the South locked in a very hostile dynamic when the Obama administration comes in. And that raises the possibility, if Obama wants to pursue dialogue with the North, that it's going to be a real challenge to kind of manage the U.S.-South Korea relationship so it's in sync. The irony is when Bush came into office, it was out of sync in the opposite way. It was the Americans who wanted to get tough, the South Koreans who wanted to engage, and that created real strains in the alliance, and I talk about them in Meltdown. Now you've got the opposite, a little bit of the opposite dynamic. So it's very complicated and not good.
Can you...
I think they are designed primarily as a deterrent. I think that they feel it's a security blanket. As I tried to indicate, they feel very beleaguered and threatened. The North Koreans saw the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the toppling of Saddam Hussein, and the conclusion they reached was he didn't have nukes, and look what happened to him, and we're not going to let it happen to us. I cannot imagine that they would use them unless the circumstances, unless they were so pressured by sanctions, by, that they just felt so backed into a corner that they had no choice. The notion that they would use them as part of, the old fear is having started the first Korean War, that they would start a second one to retake the South. Well, that's not on. I mean, they would lose. They know they would lose. The South has won that competition. So I think it's very unlikely to be used, but they see it as a deterrent. But I think the other danger, and this is the thing even more that most worries the United States, is could fissile material be made available to bad guys elsewhere, given North Korea's long track record of arms deals to places like Syria and Iran and so on. And here again, I don't think, even though they were helping Syria build a reactor, there's no evidence that any fissile material has actually left North Korea. I think the North Koreans know that if a dirty bomb goes off in New York and it's traced to North Korea is going to look like what the Israelis did to that Syrian reactor. So I think it's very unlikely, but that is certainly, I think, the thing that most worries security people in Washington and other capitals as well.
I know the Bush administration criticized the Clinton administration, and that's why it initiated the six-party talks, but they've been pretty unsuccessful. Do you think the six-party talks is the right format, just maybe with the new administration? Could it work?
Well, I don't think the six-party talks have, in fact, been unsuccessful. But the Bush administration, I think, initially saw the six-party talks as a way to get the other five parties to put the squeeze on North Korea. But in the first 2 years of the Bush administration, Washington's hard line meant that it was more often than not, instead of 5 against 1, it was Washington and Japan on one side, and then the South Koreans, the Chinese, the Russians, sort of in the middle, or more, and then or more on the North Korean side. But what the six-party talks did, and what the Bush administration eventually recognized it had to do, it gave a fig leaf to allow the U.S. to talk bilaterally with the North Koreans. And ultimately, if the six-party talks embraces the decisions that come out of those bilateral meetings, that's important because the region has a great deal at stake. But the North Koreans see this ultimately as an issue between them and the U.S., and some direct engagement is necessary, and if it's done under the rubric of the six-party talks, that's good. And there is this kind of sort of fiction. I'm not sure. The U.S. has said, we're doing everything under the six-party talks, but initially the bilateral meetings were in Beijing. Increasingly, they're not in Beijing. Chris Hill just met with his North Korean counterpart in Singapore the other day. There have been previous meetings in Singapore. There have been meetings in Berlin. So the U.S. and North Korea have a bilateral process, and a lot of the thorniest issues are getting worked out there and then brought to the six-party process. And then if the whole region signs off on them, that solidifies them, and that also does create some pressure for the North to live up to it. Someone in the back was, yes?
Between North Korea and Japan, were there any other mitigating circumstances that might have caused Japan to be upset with North Korea besides just them admitting to taking
the abductees?
The abductees.
Well, the North Korea-Japan relationship is very fraught. I mean, the reality is that Japan colonized Korea at the turn of the last century, and for almost 50 years ruled the Korean Peninsula in an extraordinarily brutal and oppressive way. And all Koreans deep down hate the Japanese. That's not a North Korean thing. Those scars are very, very deep. So that's one thing. On the Japanese side, they see the North Korean missile capability as one which could reach them. The North Korean long-range missile that might reach the U.S. is not clear how well it works, but they have medium-range missiles that could easily reach Japan, and now they've got a bomb, and even if the nuclear test, the North Stage, was not that successful, they've shown they can put fissile stuff together with explosives and blow it up. So the North Koreans, the Japanese see the North Korean nuclear and missile program as somewhat of a kind of existential threat. So it's very, very complicated. I think I can understand why the North Koreans feel the way they do about the abductees. What happened was horrible, but I compare this fixation a little bit to the obsession in some quarters in the States after the end of the Indochina War. And I think the North Koreans, who see the Japanese having abducted hundreds of thousands of Korean and other Asian women to serve as the so-called comfort women, sex slaves in World War II, find the Japanese moral outrage over 12 people a little over the top when you consider the circumstances. So there's a lot of very complicated emotions as well as genuine strategic interests here. And I think the previous Japanese Prime Minister, Fukuda, understood this and wanted to try and find a way to get beyond it. But it also, the abductee issue is very live issue in right-wing political circles in Japan. It's part of this list of issues, including denying the Nanjing massacre and other in China and Japanese atrocities in World War II. So all that plays together, and that's going to be a tough one to undo. Certainly not going to be undone while Aso, who's a right-wing type, is Prime Minister, of Japan. And I think for the Obama administration, they're going to have to figure out a way to smooth over relations with Japan and make the Japanese feel they're not being stiffed without torpedoing this diplomatic process that, although it hasn't succeeded in denuclearizing North Korea, it's got them to shut their reactor down and start dismantling it. They're not making any more of the stuff, and they're engaged in a diplomatic process. Very complicated and messy. Yes?
In your opinion, does the current economic crisis change the strategy or motivations of either the U.S. or Korea as we start negotiating again under the Obama presidency?
Well, I think it makes it even more problematic for South. The last thing South Korea now needs is tension on the Korean Peninsula when it's trying to salvage its economy. The last thing the U.S. needs is a new crisis or a new Korean War. In that sense, it increases the North Korean leverage because they know that as bad as those options are under normal circumstances, I mean, we're stuck in Iraq, we're stuck in Afghanistan, we've got this financial disaster, major tensions on the Korean Peninsula that would require in putting more military assets or putting more diplomatic energy than is already being done. We don't need that. In terms of what's bad for the North Koreans, one of the things is that it's harder to get aid. The pool of the cost of food is going up until the oil price came down abruptly recently. The cost of shipping food. So as the food shortages, which are still very acute in North Korea, remain, it's going to be harder to get international help, and the financial crisis isn't making that any easier. Yes.
I know that one of the issues, especially among some of the Korean people, is the issue of reunification with North Korea. So I was wondering if you could address what your thoughts are of a possible North-South reunification.
Well, there's a joke about this. The North Korean and the South Korean die and go to heaven, and they go to see God, and God says, "Okay, you each ask one question." And they say, "Well, God, when will the Korean Peninsula be unified?" And he looks and shrugs and says, "Well, not in my lifetime." I think the odds are not anytime soon. I think there's an emotional thing on both sides clearly, but from the South Korean point of view, they don't want to have a job that will be 10 times harder than what West Germany had absorbing East Germany. The last thing they need is to inherit a basket case that they have to fix. The North Koreans, of course, are not interested in reunification under terms that require the dissolution of the North Korean state. And as I mentioned, I think the North Korea is more resilient than it's given credit for, and is not going to just collapse when Kim Jong-il dies. I think the army is very powerful. It's the dominant institution in the country. As long as the elite hang together, they know that if they don't hang together, they'll hang separately. And the North Korean elite look around at what happened to the East German elite, how they lost everything, or they look what happened to former presidents in South Korea who've been jailed. So they don't see a future as in a unified Korea that they don't call the shots. So there are a lot of reasons why the North Korean elite, as bad as the situation is and as unhappy as they may be with some of it, don't want to see the thing collapse and be absorbed into the South. So I think it's very unlikely in the near or medium term. What is conceivable in the happiest scenario that I can see is one in which they somehow get this diplomatic thing back on track. It leads to enough of a thaw that you start having more trade and exchanges and gradual opening of the North Korean economy. Leads to a soft landing that allows some kind of formal confederation of some kind in 15, 20, 30 years. But a functioning unified state, I'd be very surprised if we'll see it in the foreseeable future. Yes?
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on see if I can word this correctly. If there's any plan looking past the nuclear issue, whether one way it's denuclearized, what's the strategy for dealing with North Korea, or if it becomes a nuclear power and multilateral talks don't succeed in denuclearizing the state? What's the plan for dealing with a nuclear North Korea? That is it confrontational versus, regime change, that sort of thing?
Well, I think your first point is a very valid one about, it's not just the nuclear. The nuclear issue is a function of a broader series of issues. And interestingly, in the six-party talks, one of the agreements they reached that haven't really gone very far, but a series of working groups were set up to look at a whole host of issues. One was on U.S.-North Korea relations. One was on Japan-North Korea relations. One was on sort of a Northeast Asia security. Part of any long-term deal is going to have to involve a formal peace agreement. Don't forget, the Korean War, shooting stopped in 1953, but there's only an armistice. We're still technically at war with North Korea, which is a point they always like to make when the U.S. demands access to military facilities and so on. And so an eventual deal would have to involve a formal peace agreement, the armistice replaced by a formal peace deal that would involve recognition and all the rest of that. So I know there's some thinking about that, and ideally, and I think frankly the reality is the North isn't going to go that much further in giving up what it has unless some of these bigger things that it feels will ensure its security are addressed. The issue of what happens if the North Koreans clearly aren't going to give up their nukes, that's a tough one. On a military front, we don't know where their stuff is. It's not like the Israelis going after the one reactor in Iraq, in Osirak in 1981. They wiped it out and set Saddam Hussein's nuclear plants back. It's all hidden in mountains somewhere. The Yongbyon reactor isn't functioning now anyway, so there's not much value in taking it out. So there isn't a military action that, with any degree of confidence, could actually take out the North's military facilities. And the North has a strong, even though it's weakened by fuel shortages and lack of spare parts and all the rest of that, they have over a million people in their army. They have 10, 12, 15,000 artillery pieces within easy range of Seoul. Within 20 minutes of an American bomb dropping anywhere in North Korea, they could turn Seoul, as they have said, they've used this phrase, into a sea of fire. They've got short-range missiles that could land on American bases in South Korea. They've got medium-range missiles that could hit targets in Japan. They have long-range missiles that could conceivably hit the U.S., and the U.S. is already in 2 wars. So a military option is a non-starter. They may calculate that Washington may conclude that a North Korea that is not making any more bombs, that is in a more amicable and engaged relationship, that has 5 bombs stuck in a cave somewhere, is something the U.S., given the choices, is going to have to live with. And they may say, we could get rid of those after you've had an embassy in our capital for 5 years, and we're confident you're not going to whack us. So, they may end up winning in one sense, except their society is such a mess that the question is, what happens to their people, how long, what will the internal stresses do? But I think a military option, unless you decide to go in and topple the North Korean government, and I think that's a non-starter. Yes?
Yeah, I just have a question. You mentioned the abortion and some of the things that are involved in the North Korean problem, and then also the lights and kind of the flashiness of, in North Korea. Mm-hmm. My question is this: how much of the problem or the equation do you think is sort of national pride? How much of an issue is that? And if it is a large issue, what can we do? I know with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it seems to me that kind of the final thing that helps solve the problem is Robert Kennedy's willingness to tell his brother to ignore the one letter and then to look and kind of not stay with the hard line, but sort of look at maybe that their intentions aren't exactly as they appear. How much of an issue do you think that is here? And so then they have the peace talks behind the doors, and to avoid Russia's looking weak and America's looking weak. And so what?
I think pride and face are huge. They're and it's more huge in an Asian setting where face, as any of you who've been and spent any time in Asia know, is a huge issue. The North Koreans have been desperate for legitimacy, and for the first 5 or 6 years of the Bush administration, one of the central planks of the hardline approach was to deny North Korea legitimacy at every stage of the way. And in fact, one of the people I talked to who went to North Korea after the famous visit by Secretary Kelly and his group in 2002, he said the North Koreans were far more angry that he would not host a reciprocal banquet the second night than they were about the accusation about uranium. So, and I think that, it's important under normal circumstances, but it's, as I say, because it's an Asian society and you have a society structured around worship of the leader as a kind of godlike figure. So policies that essentially disrespect that and delegitimize that are not going to have the desired effect of bringing the North to its knees. So I think it's a valid concern. Well, I think the approach of serious diplomacy in a respectful way that involves real give and take. It's not just us demanding and them agreeing. I think the record shows you can make some headway. How much headway? Open to discussion. Do we want to sort of take a brief break if people have to leave? I'm happy to stick around and chat with anybody else. If any of you want to leave and are being polite, don't be. Those of you who want to stick around and chat, I'm not going anywhere. So, all right, the few people who have fled. Carry on. Okay,
so the culture, pride, symbolic diplomacy.
Actually, let me just interrupt you briefly. If any of you want to buy the book, wave and I'll run out and sign it, and we can then continue the discussion. You get a almost $10 discount from the store. Anyway, carry on.
What then is what are the obstacles to a peace treaty? If we're going to make so much headway through legitimizing diplomacy, is it just by keeping us apart from or keeping us from doing that?
Well, you can't just wave a wand and do it. There are a lot of issues, and a lot of things have to be sorted out. One of the ideas that you hear about. Proposals the suggestions for Obama is that he pick like a very high level on former Defense Secretary Bill Perry and Colin Powell, for example, send them to Pyongyang and say we are coming representing both parties and the president to say to you, if you are serious about a new relationship that fundamentally changes everything in a good way, that's doable. And this is a gesture, But to do that, we're not going to do it while you pretend to denuclearize, And we can talk about a timetable of things that, we will do, and in return you have to specifically do it. So it has to be sorted out. I think one of the problems in the Bush administration has been that even though the so-called engagers, won the day in the end, there was so much internal fighting and sniping, and I think. The president's kind of default position on North Korea is he can't stand it, and he's visibly uncomfortable. When you watch him talk about it, it's clear he's visibly uncomfortable about, saying nice things about North Korea. So I think an administration with a clean slate would have a better shot at it. But the question is, will the North Koreans feel, well, we've got our nukes, they don't have as much leverage as they did, we don't need this anymore. My own sense is it's still worth making the effort, because if it becomes very clear that the U.S. is, in fact, it's not Bush anymore, it's Obama who campaigned on we have to talk to our adversaries. If the North Koreans are dissing him, it will be much easier for the U.S. to go to the Chinese and the South Koreans and the Russians and everybody else and say, we made a serious good faith effort and these guys are not going to play ball, so we now have to revisit. But, the other problem for Obama is he has a few other things on his plate. And I think right now what they would like is just for North Korea to stay off the radar screen for a while they get all the more immediate things sorted out. And the North Koreans have a nasty habit of not staying off the radar screen when you want them. So that, if they feel they're being ignored or, not taken seriously, they can ratchet things up quite considerably and quickly. Yes?
Why did you decide to write this book? And also, being a journalist, you had access to very important sources. How much of the information we receive is deceiving? deceiving. It's not
true?
accurate. Yeah.
Well, the first question, I wrote the book because, I covered this Korea story for a very long time, and it just became more and more clear that there was a lot more to it than was evident in the heat of the moment, and that the nature of what news is this happened today, this official said this official went there, that there's a whole other layer, and you really can't get to that easily in journalism, especially when working for a 24-hour news network where you're just prisoner of deadlines and headlines and deadlines. And in terms of, people say all kinds of deceptive things, and one of the challenges in writing the book was I did all these interviews, and I talked at great length with, except for Bush, Cheney, Bill Clinton, and Condi Rice, I talked to pretty much everybody who had anything to do with Korea policy on the U.S. side. Talked to people in Japan, South Korea, took the Chinese. People lie, dissemble, people remember things differently, and one of the great challenges was it was like assembling a huge jigsaw puzzle. You go talk to one person who was in a meeting and get their version. You talk to somebody else, you get their version. You figure out what they agree on, what they don't agree on, go back and look at the newspaper headlines of the day or press conference transcripts of the day. Then you call somebody up and say, well, so-and-so remembers it this way, and then you are able to read. Sometimes I had to say, people recollect it differently. But even though they didn't like each other and didn't agree, there wasn't that much disagreement about what they did and said about each other in Washington. The loathing was mutual, and they weren't shy about it. Yes.
Beyond the current problems, I heard the notion that perhaps the neighbors, China and Japan, are not enthused about a unified Korea to begin with.
That's a very interesting question. The Chinese, I think, have some concerns. A unified Korea under a pro-Western South Korean government with a security treaty with the United States, I don't think is something that the Chinese want. And although the Chinese pay lip service to Korean unification, they would probably not be unhappy to see a Korean peninsula divided for a long time to come, as long as it remains stable. I think their great fear is instability. Japan the same way. As I mentioned, there's no love lost between the Japanese and the Koreans. A strong, unified Korea, given the enormous capabilities of the Korean people and the economic strength of South Korea and the work ethic in the North and the natural resources, and it would become a much more powerful player. So not everybody in the region is going to embrace that. I think you're right.
Look into the future as a North Korean. It seems there are two paradigms that are operating. One would be to follow a Chinese model, which is the streets paved with gold. I mean, it's a wonderful way to go. Everybody's going to be prosperous and all of that. Why don't we go that way? Well, that's the other paradigm, and that is the security issue. That Kim Jong-il, when he looks at Ceausescu's bloody body in the street there, but for the grace of God go I. And if things don't go well, and if they go a Chinese route and things are too liberal, too quick, and they're ousted, they're dead. So the whole Kim Ilsung group, which is mostly blood-related and marriage-related people, they have to be very, very cautious on those two paradigms. What chances do you see of them going a Chinese route?
You've hit the nail exactly on the head. I mean, North Korea is like this mummy that's been preserved in this underground cave, and if you open it up to the fresh air, just dissolve. And on the other hand, I think smart North Koreans know that that ultimately this is unsustainable. I mean, they can hang on for a while, but a society in which everybody is hungry and everybody is miserable is not viable in the long run. And there's a long-running debate about are there any reformers in North Korea? I mean, I've heard serious foreign diplomats in Pyongyang argue that Kim Jong-il is the most liberal guy in North Korea, that he gets it. And in fact, there have been some intriguing signs. He's made some trips to China where the Chinese have taken him to the special economic zones down in the south near Hong Kong. They took him to a joint venture factory in Shanghai. They've extolled the virtues of their reform process. And, this has been on North Korean TV. The last time I was there, admittedly, it was almost 3 years ago now, it did feel a little bit, reminded me a little bit of China sort of right after Mao died, so 1977. More Western business people on the plane. There were a few private markets, a few private restaurants. It amounts to nothing more than tinkering. Whether they would do more than that, I don't know. I mean, a leadership transition in which the military comes out as calling the shots reduces that likelihood. And it certainly does while all of these tensions with South Korea are there and while the nuclear issue with the U.S. is not resolved. If, on the other hand, they can somehow manage to move ahead on the nuclear front and get North-South with some kind of equilibrium, it's possible the North will feel more open to doing it formally. The other element, though, is there is a kind of informal economy that's begun to arise in the North out of necessity because the food distribution system broke down, and so more people are sort of growing and selling things on their own. You know, I hear people say you see, peddlers selling stuff on the streets, and you have a growing number of North Koreans who are going back and forth to China, not just refugees, but to trade, and they're bringing back with them video cassettes and DVDs of South Korean TV soap operas and cell phone, the cell phones that work on the Chinese network. A very interesting tidbit. One of my former colleagues was in North Korea earlier in the year, and one of the guides, who had been a particularly sort of hardline guy, took somebody aside and pulled out this little cell phone chip, SIM card, and he said, "This is my Chinese SIM card. When I come to Beijing, I can call you." And so does this mean change is on the way? Unlikely. Does it mean there are things bubbling around that could be important if things broke a certain way? I think yes, but not immediately, not cataclysmically, and very limited until some of these other issues make some headway on.
I read in the paper that on the night before the September 19th, the 2005 meeting, China hosted a moon festival banquet where they invite all the lead negotiators to attend and do some last informal kind of meetings. And the article made the point that they were on the impression that during that time, China kind of made it clear to the U.S. that if they didn't make concessions the next day, that the blame would be on America. So, have you heard anything about that, or kind of what was?
Yeah, I mean, I write about all of these. I write in great detail in the book. If you're interested, it's got chapter and verse by the people who were there about all this stuff. The Chinese, at various points, particularly in the 2005 talks, were the sort of honest broker, going back and forth between the North Koreans and the Americans over different formulations of what would and would not be in the agreement. And they did at a number of points get very fed up with the U.S., and they did in fact say, if this breaks down, it's going to be your fault. And they played an extremely constructive role, and I think they got very exasperated. They're sort of used to being exasperated with the North Koreans, but they got very exasperated with the Americans. That negotiation in particular was one in which Hill had on his team people from sort of all the warring agencies in Washington, and they were all on the phone to their individual lords and masters, undercutting him, and it climaxed with, this is a classic tale, which is a true story. They finally got this thing all worked out, and they're waiting the morning to sort of go into the final ceremony. And Hill gets a call from Condoleezza Rice, and one of the words, the language of the agreement talked about how the U.S. and North Korea would agree to peaceful coexistence. And unbeknownst to Hill, another guy on his delegation, Victor Cha from the National Security Council, and I think one other person objected to that term. They said that's a sort of Cold War term. We can't use it. It's a North Korean, commie term. So they got to Hadley, Steve Hadley, who was National Security Advisor, got to Rice. The Rice calls says, can't have it. Have to change it. And Hill's furious. So he goes to the Chinese and he say, sorry, my boss says, if the Chinese said, you're crazy. If you ask for a change at the last minute, you know the North Koreans are going to ask for a change. And then the whole thing, he'll said, sorry, I got my orders. And the Chinese balked. So then Rice said, get me the Chinese foreign minister. He said, he's not in town. So they had to find him somewhere in the middle of China. She got on the phone with him. So the compromise was, in English, they changed peaceful coexistence to coexist peacefully. And then the Chinese took the North Koreans aside and they said, look, in your language and in our language, the wording for coexist peacefully and peaceful coexist is identical. Let them have it. In Korean, it's not going to change a word. The North Koreans said, okay. But it gives you a sense of the craziness of the whole process, especially before Hill really got control of it and was able to neutralize a lot of those people going forward. Yes? May make this the last one, and then we can chat informally.
How do you account for the pretty dramatic about-face on the part of the Bush team? Did the engagers finally outflank their hardline opponents? Did Bush decide he wants a legacy, and so he's going to change his tack? If you ask Victor Cha, he just happened to bump into someone at an airport, and that's how it all started. So, I mean,
the true version of that's in my book also. No, I think a couple of things happened. I think Rice, when she became Secretary of State, looked around the world and saw one screw up after another. Hill is a real operator. He's a very impressive guy, and I think he made clear that he thought he could do something if given a chance to do so. And of course, the timing is 2005, 2006. Iraq was in a total mess, and the neocons were increasingly discredited. And their clout was eroded, culminating in November of 2006 when the Democrats regained control of Congress. And Cheney was preoccupied with Scooter Libby being on trial, and Rumsfeld was forced out. So the internal balance of power for these other reasons shifted. And then I think the other critical thing was the nuclear test, because it became clear after the nuclear test. I think the nuclear test really shook people up. And it became clear, despite the UN passing a resolution on sanctions, that when Rice went to the region in later October of 2006, the Japanese were always on board. But when she went to South Korea and when she went to Beijing, she was told, forget it. We're not going to play ball with these sanctions. Moreover, the Chinese had just had an envoy who'd seen Kim Jong-il, and he said, I think there's something to do. And so I think the nuclear test made clear that there was a kind of law of diminishing returns here, that squeezing North Korea was getting first missile tests, and then they did the nuclear test despite criticism from the UN resolution, criticism from all over the world. This negative spiral was getting dangerous, and I think given the weakened condition of the hardline, this was one of the episodes where Hill violated his instructions. I write about it in Meltdown. He went to Pyongyang at the end of October, and his instructions were you can have a three-way meeting with the Chinese and the North Koreans to talk about this. The Chinese, who were getting really fed up with stuff, they arranged a lunch, and at the end of the lunch, Wu Da-wei, the Chinese envoy, got up and said, I'm going out, see you later. And he left Hill with Kim Gae-gwan, and Hill's choice was to say, I can't be in the same room with you, or to say, forget it, I'm just going to ignore the instructions and talk. And so he did, and they spent the whole afternoon talking, and he gave the North Koreans two things that they'd been asking for. One was he promised the U.S. would work with them to establish a bilateral mechanism to resolve the dispute over the money in this bank in Macau. And the second was the fact of the bilateral meeting. And that night, the North Koreans agreed to come back to the six-party talks. That was Halloween of 2006. And by mid-February, they'd reached this deal, which goes to show, if you reach out halfway, you can make some headway with the North. But I think I think Bush, somebody described it in one of the interviews I did, that there's a kind of split in Bush between his head and his gut or his heart on this. In his heart, he hates these guys for completely legitimate reasons. It's the most horrible regime around. Look what they do. His head tells him that that's a very emotionally satisfying thing that leads nowhere in practice. And I had some very senior officials say to me, Bush would get into this thing about the North Koreans, and then he would sort of run to Powell and say, Colin, get me out of this mess. And so I think part of it was Bush himself realized, the practical side of Bush realized, that this was a dead end and that it had to find a way out. And so all of that coalesced, especially in late 2006 and 07. Yes?
Okay, you talked a little bit about the souring of the relationship between North Korea and Japan. For the past few decades, the United States has been pressuring Japan to increase its military, to not rely so much on the United States for its military security. I'm wondering if in the future, if Japan does move in that direction and starts to strengthen its military more towards a regular army similar to other countries, what ramifications is that going to have in the region, specifically with North Korea and its nuclear program? What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's not going to play well with either Korea. There's still, as I mentioned, deep distrust going back to the era of Japanese colonialism. I think that sort of has reached the kind of high water mark in the early Bush period when Bush and Koizumi were great friends, and post 9/11 but the reality is that the Japanese, I don't think there's a consensus in Japan to do much more than they're doing. I don't think they would have a support to rewrite their constitution, and their political system is so screwed up right now, and their economy is not doing well. So I think the reality, I mean, right now the Americans are complaining the Japanese aren't doing enough on things they've already agreed to do. So I think it's an issue, but I don't see any practical likelihood in the near term that the Japanese are going to actually be able to do anything with it, which makes the U.S.-Japan security relationship very important, and one of the things that President Obama is going to have to do is to sort of get things on a somewhat more even keel. Yeah.
I have to go, but I would really love your signature.
Oh, great. Well, thank you.